Hello everyone, this is Ethan Dragon, and welcome back to another episode of Fire Emblem Heroes. In this episode of the Damage Calc series, we'll be taking a look at some things you'll need to know before we actually dive into computing with actual numbers when you're doing your damage calcs. So, unfortunately, there's no universally accepted syntax among the community, with some terms for operations that we do in damage calcs. But I'm going to mention some of the various terms that tend to be used, and for the remainder of the series here, I'll be using my own terminology, so it might be a bit confusing at first, but with more examples, I think it'll be clear what I'm talking about when I use my own terminology. So most of the terminology comes from what happens to decimals that show up in calculations, because most of the time you're not going to have nice whole integer numbers throughout the entire computations unless you're doing something like applying the 20% weapon triangle advantage bonus to an attack stat of 50. Well, you're just going to get 60, so there's no decimal there. But if you have, say, 53 attack, then you'll see here that we end up with the 63.6. So what do we actually do with this? And it turns out, as we'll discuss later in the series, that for most operations, you're just going to do this thing called truncation, which is chopping off anything after the decimal point, to the right of the decimal point. And I know in a lot of places that they don't use a dot to denote the decimal place, they use a comma, so you'll have to bear with me on that. Unfortunately, my calculator does not cannot use both at the same time, Kappa, so we're going to just stick with what it does with the dot or period, whatever you want to call it, denoting the decimal place. So in this case for truncation, 63.6 would truncate to 63, but it literally does not matter what numbers come after the decimal. You're never going to see this in your damage calcs, I don't think, but this would also truncate to 63, and it doesn't matter how large the number is after the decimal point, it still truncates to 63, and well, 63.00 truncates to 63. I hope that's straightforward there. But it can be a bit confusing sometimes when explaining in damage calcs how to use truncation. There's some scenarios and shortcuts that we tend to use where truncation isn't necessarily the best term to use. So there's also these math terms called the floor function and the ceiling function. If you're familiar with them, then my personal terminology will make some sort of sense. But if you're not familiar, that's what this episode is for. So I say round down and round up with the intention of just describing which direction you're supposed to round. And so if you're familiar with the number line, when I say round up, I just mean to round to the integer closest to that number away from 0. If that doesn't make sense, here's an example. So here, if I say to round up 62.3, you would round it to 63. If you have, for example, the number 35.63, you would round this up to 36. Hopefully it's starting to make some sense, but in case not, let's do one more example here. If we have 72.1256 here, you would round this up to 73. And if we're looking at negative numbers, for example, negative 13.56, we would round this up to negative 14, because on the number line, negative 14 is further away from 0 than negative 13 is. So that's probably the most confusing part, but for most of the series, we're actually never going to work with negative numbers. So we won't have to worry about that too much, because there's ways to work around just avoiding the negative numbers altogether and some confusion associated with them. So that'll be great. But then we have the latter end of things, rounding down. So for like 35.6, you would round down to 35. Typically when people learn rounding, they're accustomed to rounding, say, 35.6 to 36, which is correct in that context. But when I say round down, it doesn't matter what comes after the decimal point. You just gotta round down to the closest integer towards 0. So again, 35.6 rounds down to 35 using my terminology, but even like 35.953247 also rounds down to 35. And of course, a number super close to 35, like 35.00001, also rounds down to 35. And, well, it should be straightforward that 35.00 rounds down to 35. You don't go down to 34. Please don't do that. And for negative numbers, something like negative 3.7 rounds down to minus 3, which, again, can be a bit confusing. So we're going to try and avoid negative numbers in general. But that's going to actually be it for this episode. I should probably also mention that in future episodes we're going to be seeing a lot more of this calculator, because I think it'll be useful for people to actually see the numbers that are getting tossed around, rather than me just saying the numbers, because it's definitely pretty difficult to keep track of it all. But until next time, in the next episode, we'll be taking a look at some of the basic operations, like applying the weapon triangle and effective damage. We're mostly going to be working in the order that shenanigans and different mechanics appear in the actual formula. So we're going to dive straight into effective damage and weapon triangle at the same time, because if you recall in a previous episode, you're actually supposed to apply effective damage first, and it turns out you also have to round down before you apply the weapon triangle, because otherwise you may or may not get an inaccurate result. Until then, thanks for watching. As always, this is Ether Dragon, and hope to see you all next time. Bye.